And then I'm just going to sketch out what I want to build today. Make my font a little bit bigger. No, I refuse to use a strange font. I just increased the font size. And so what I want to do today is build or start building a Rails application that will sort of show off how, from the ground up, to build an application that includes a bunch of different models and models that have some associations between them. And so we're going to go to the land of Harry Potter, and we're going to model Hogwarts on Rails. And we're going to build a website where we have a model for a house. And a house is going to have a name, and that's going to be a string. And a house is going to have some points associated with it, which is going to be an integer. And then we're also going to have a student model where a student has a name, which is also a string. And then a student is going to have a reference to house. There's going to be a foreign key reference. And so the student's going to have a house ID, and that's going to be a foreign key to the houses table. And so if you remember how active record works, the house model will be associated with a houses table, and the student model will be associated with a students table. And then the other things that active record will add into those tables, which is like every one of these tables will just automatically get a primary key called ID. And then they will both also get the timestamps. So they'll get like a created at timestamp and a updated at timestamp. Both of them, this one and this one. So that's how we're going to start things off today. Is I'm going to create a new Rails project for Hogwarts, and then we're going to first create the house model. We want to do, the order is going to be somewhat important. If we tried to create the student model first, it would be hard to set up the foreign key to something that doesn't yet exist, right? Because students are going to belong to a house. And so I will set up the house first, assigning it name and points. Then I will set up the student, giving them name and a reference to the already existent house. From that point, I'm going to make a very simple seed script, and a seed script is just an active record script that's going to put a bunch of fake data into my database. And then we're going to work at creating some more of the web side of things. So we're going to start just in model land, where you sort of are right now with the most recent challenge that you've been working on. And then we're going to step out of the models and make a controller and some views to start actually, producing HTML that will pull data from these two tables. So that is the goal, and it's all going to start by me going to my full stack folder where I put my Rails applications, and I'm going to run a command here, which is just the Rails command to create a new Rails website, and I'm going to call it Hogwarts 2020. And that's going to go and do what you saw the Rails new command do the last time we went through it, which is it starts off by, if I scroll up to the top here, creating a bunch of files and folders so that every Rails project has the same directory structure. It's going to initialize our project as a Git repository. So it does a Git init on the current working directory. It's going to put into the root folder, amongst other things, a gem file, and then the project will run bundle install. It'll then load up all of the gems that are required. And after that, it's going to run a yarn install, because in the root folder, there's also a package.json file, which is the JavaScript sort of equivalent of a gem file, right? That's where all of our JavaScript dependencies are going to live. So that's what's running right here. This is yarn install. running the JavaScript dependency installation. So that's going to take a little bit of time to render out. So I will go back over here and talk a little bit more about what we're going to do after we create those two models. So I want a website where initially I can go to a page and I can see all of the houses in the school and the number of points that students have accumulated for those houses. And so I'm going to create a controller, and it's going to be a houses controller. And that controller is going to have, at least initially, 2 actions. And in Rails, actions tend to fall into 2 camps. One camp are collection actions, and those have to do with the sort of the table that the controller is associated with as a whole. And so we're going to have a action called index, and that's going to like show all houses. And then there's also going to be a member action, which is just going to be show, and then this is going to be in charge of showing one house by ID. Rails has finished doing its thing. Just in case you're coding along and you're still chugging away there, I'll give us a few more moments. What I want from a routing perspective, because remember we're dealing with like an MVC system here. So the M or model we've discussed above here. The C is just currently going to be one controller, the houses controller. For the routing, so the routes, I'm going to set up the fact that a GET request just to the root folder or the root path of my domain. So just in my case, it's going to be up on localhost. So it's just going to be when I do localhost 3000, a GET request of that. I want that to go to the houses controller's index action. And a GET request to slash houses slash some ID. And this is just me putting in like a placeholder for some numeric identifier. I'm going to want that to route to the houses controller's show action. So that's how these 2 actions are going to be stitched up to connect to HTTP endpoints. And then in terms of views, there's going to be one view associated with each one of those things. And so we're going to have views. Specifically, we're going to have in the app views houses folder, an index.html.erb. That's going to map to this action right here. And a show.html.erb, and that's going to map to this action right here. And then the only other bit of quote unquote wiring that's going to exist in our system is this route here that has this ID placeholder here. That's going to be how this show action knows which house to load by ID. Any questions so far about sort of what we're planning on building here? Does this make sense? So? Does everybody know Harry Potter? Is there anyone in the room that has not seen a Harry Potter movie or read a Harry Potter book? For real? So do you know what I'm talking about then in terms of like houses and students? Kind of. So like just for super clarity, wizards and witches go to Hogwarts and then they're assigned to a house, which is like they're going to school. They sort of go to this house, which is sort of they're like, it's like a clubhouse. They're part of the gang. And then they have to sort of what they do, the teachers give them points. And so they're accumulating points for their house or sometimes losing points for their house. And that's going to give us our relationship. So a student is going to belong to one house and one house only. And a house is going to have many students. So there's a one-to-many association between those things. And I highly recommend reading the Harry Potter books. What is the creation command? Sorry, that was just Rails new, and then it's always just the name of the project that you're creating. Right on. So the plans are ready to go. we are going to navigate to that folder that I've just created, which is the Hogwarts 2020 folder. And in VS Code, in my Explorer here, I'm going to add that folder as well. So I'm going to go to my Mount C full stack, go to where I put my Rails apps, and then pull up the Hogwarts 2020 folder in there as well. And that gives me the ability to see the folder structure. And then just a quick recap of like the folders here that are important. There is a app folder, and this is where our MVC stuff goes. So our models are going to go in this model folder, our views are going to go in the view folder, and our controllers are going to go in the controllers folder. So the MVC stuff all lives inside of this app folder. The routes, which is sort of the missing letter from the MVC acronym, they exist in this config folder in a single file. There is a routes.rb file in that config folder. The other folder we'll be working with today will be the DB folder. That's going to be where our database seed script is going to be written. That's going to populate our database. And then our SQLite database file is actually going to be in this DB folder. And then the sort of incremental changes that we make to the database are going to be captured in this folder as well as what are called migrations. So there's going to be a migration folder in here. The other thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be using Git to capture the changes over time to this project. And so this project is a Git repository. It has no commits to it yet. And I can commit to it either from the command line or just with the built-in tooling in VS Code. So there's the source control option here. It's showing me all the outstanding files and folders that haven't yet been captured. And so I'm just going to commit those all right now as the initial commit. So you could do this from the command line. We could do like a git add dot and then a git commit -m with some message. But more often you'll see me just using VS Code. Sometimes if I just happen to be at the terminal, I might do the commits there, but I typically do it from VS Code these days. So I'm just going to say initial commit of our Hogwarts Rails project. And then if I hit Control Enter, it'll say, do you want to stage everything there and commit it? And the answer is yes, I do. And now you can see my prompt is picked up like there's at least one commit, I'm on the master branch, and there's no outstanding changes. I usually have 3 different terminals running. So one of those terminals will be running the Rails server. So this is the Rails HTTP server. With the current version of Rails, it's an application called Puma, and it loads itself up on port 3000. And so I've run Rails space S, or you can even type out the full word server, Rails space server. And once that is in place, I can go to localhost 3000 and just see that things are operational. It says, yay, you're on Rails. This has been served up from that Puma server on port 3000. We're going to eventually remove this little welcome message, but it's there right now. And if we look here, where I ran Rails S, every time we interact with the server, we're going to see that interaction happen here. So you can see that that index was, the welcome index is being loaded. So I'm going to click this little plus button here and open up another terminal. And in this one, I'm going to run the Rails console, which is a version of the interactive Ruby prompt. So it's a little command line REPL where I can type in Ruby code, and it'll execute it. The nice thing about the Rails console is though it's also going to give me access to my models. And so I can interact with the models and then through the models interact with the database here. Then I'm going to open a third bash prompt, and this is just going to be for me running other Rails commands. So if we look at our plan, the plan was to start with the models here. So I got some models being created, specifically a house model and a student model. I'm not going to do what I did in the first Rails demo where I used scaffolding. Instead, I'm going to generate the pieces one by one. So scaffolding went and created the model, the view, the controller, the routes, everything all at once. Here I'm going to sort of piecewise, because I don't need everything. I don't need a full CRUD task. I only want really 2 actions, 2 routes, 2 views. So I'm not going to use scaffolding here. Sometimes scaffolding is just a little too much. And so I'm going to do a Rails G for generate. And then what do I want to generate? It's not a scaffold this time. Instead, it's a model, specifically the house model. And we said a moment ago that a house has a name and a certain number of points. So I can say name colon string and points colon integer. And so when I run that, it's going to do a few things for me. One, it's going to create a migration. And a migration is a description of a change to the database. And then it'll also create the model for me. So in the app models folder, it's going to put a house.rb file. And so you can see here's the migration. It put into the db migrate folder. And then there's the model. We can go see them here and pull them up in the app models folder. There's the house model. It's empty right now. We're going to put some stuff into it in a moment. And then in the DB folder, we can see in the migrate folder right there, we've got a migration that describes in sort of Ruby code the changes that are going to be made to my database. The change here being that we're creating a table called houses and the columns that exist on it. And the reason why these migrations are super handy is that they are now part of source control. And so if we were working with a large team, everyone would see a new migration appear in the repository and everybody could run this migration and the whole team could synchronize their databases. So we're going to do just that right now. We're going to run the migration. And that's with a Rails db migrate. In your travels on the internet, you might sometimes see people reference rake db migrate. It's exactly the same thing. So the db migrate task runner looks in that migration folder, looks for any migrations that haven't yet been run, and it runs them. If I tried to run it again, it would know that there is no more new migrations to run. So running it a second time doesn't do anything at all. If you're like me, your WSL will, or Rails or something, will constantly warn you about this insecure world writable directory. It's just a warning. It doesn't actually mean anything's wrong. I've tried to get rid of it in the past and I haven't been able to, and so I just ignore it. It hasn't affected my Rails sites at all. So after running that command, we can actually switch over to our interactive Ruby prompt. And if we run reload, it'll reload any of the models that's in the model folder. And I now have access to those models. So I could say like house.new, and it'll be like, oh, a house has an ID and a name and some points and created at and updated at. And that's exactly what we want it to have. So that's good. I mean, further, I could even start creating houses here, right? I could do a house.create, glutton claw, That's a Harry Potter house, right? And has a lot of points. Uh-oh, what have I done wrong? I didn't put the points in there. I have to actually say what these things are. So when I create, I have to say, like, this is the name, and these are the points. And then this create statement here translates into a SQL insert statement. So I now have direct access to my database by way of my model. Okay, so I can go back to my source control and I can say created house model and ran associated migration. One of the things I try to do when I'm demoing stuff in class is I try to model like good Git practice. Like you'll see me trying to capture like incremental commits over time, and I'm trying not to lump together a bunch of changes. I'm trying to sort of make them small and self-contained and well explained in the commit messages. But because the apps I'm building aren't like real production apps, and I'm just sort of like effectively making little toy websites, the thing I'm not doing that I would say would be best practice for Git commit messages is when you see me type a Git commit message, I'm usually describing the change that I just made, which isn't very helpful for a Git commit message because that information is already in Git, right? Git captures the changes over time. So anyone looking at a Git history will always be able to see what changed at any given commit because they can look at the deltas, right? You can go on GitHub, you can click on a commit, and you can see exactly what changed. So a good commit message doesn't actually describe what changed. It should describe why you made the change. Now, for me, why I made the change is like I'm giving a demo in class, right? So it wouldn't be interesting for me to always just type, well, I made this change because, you know, that's the next thing I'm doing in class. But in an actual work environment, if someone's looking back at Git history, they usually want to see what your intention was because they're probably looking back to figure out why a change was made or why a bug was introduced or why a decision in the code was done the way it was. And so if you write your Git commit messages, make sure you're always putting your intention in there and not something like what was actually changed because the tooling already knows that and can supply that to the user. All right, that's this first thing done. We've created our house model. The next thing we want to do is the student model, and this is going to have the reference to the house. It's going to be the one-to-many association. So I'm going to go back to my bash prompt here, and I'm going to do a Rails generate model. What am I generating? Well, I am generating a student model where a student has a name, which is a string. And then in this case, to make the reference to house, I just write the name of the model that I want to reference, and I explain that it references. So Rails generate model. The model's name is student. A student has a name, which is a string. This will become a varchar in the database. And a student references a house. And that means that it'll have the foreign key. So there'll be a house ID assigned to student. So I can hit enter now on this command. And just like the other Rails G command, it's going to create for me a migration, this one right here, and a student model. So I'll close the old migration and open the new one up. So here's the new student model. Here's the new student migration. Here you can see in the migration, it's describing the change that's being made. The change is that we're creating a table. The name of the table is students. A student has a name column, and a student references a house. This reference cannot be null. And this is a bit of a gotcha with, I think it's specifically with SQLite 3. One of the things we'll see with migrations is sometimes you don't know everything about your database to begin with. So we could have potentially created the students table and then realized after the fact, oh, a student should reference a house. With SQLite, having a reference added after the fact to a table with null set to false will cause problems and the migration won't run. And the fix is just, it's a bit of a cheap fix, is to set that to true. Meaning you could allow nulls in there and then SQLite will process it. When we then actually go to production and run this on Postgres, Postgres won't have a problem with a reference added after the fact with null being false, but that's just a bit of a gotcha that when we're working with SQLite, I find that happens often. So we'll leave that for now because this is not after the fact, this is at the time of creation, so SQLite will be okay with no nulls on that reference. And then specifically, this is going to be a foreign key, so we're going to have an index on this key created as well. So when we want to run this migration, we go back to our bash prompt and we run Rails db migrate. We give it a moment and we get our student table. If we look at the model, because when we generated the student, we explained that a student references a house, Rails has put in there the little helper method that belongs to. This sets up the association. So but we have to put the association on the other side of the connection here, which is in house. So a student belongs to a house, and a house has many students, plural. And again, this is where pluralization becomes really important. Sometimes when people are new to Rails, they don't know if, should this have an S on it? Shouldn't it have an S on it? If you say it aloud, like if you say the sentence out loud, it should sound grammatically correct, right? A student belongs to a single house, right? Because the student is the one that has the foreign key. You wouldn't say houses here, because if this is the table that has the foreign key, you can't belong to more than one house. So a student belongs to a house, and on the other side, a house has many students. And it wouldn't make sense grammatically to say has many student. And so if you're ever forgetting the pluralization there, just say it out loud and it'll hopefully help you figure out if you need the S on the end or not. So with those two associations in place, the has to and belongs to, or has many and belongs to, we can go back over to our Rails console here. Anytime I make a change or an addition of a new model or a change to a model, I have to run reload. But I should now be able to create students and associate students to houses. And so I already have a house in the system, which is the Glutton Claw house. That's the first house. And so to create a student associated with that house, just to make sure that this is actually working properly, I can say gluttonclaw.students.create, and I can say Wally Glutton is the name of a student that belongs to that particular house. And boom, that creates an insert statement. We get a new student object. The student has been added to the database. They have a primary key of 1, a name of Wally Glutton, which is what we asked for. They've automatically been assigned to the house that created them. So Glutton Claw had the primary key of 1. So the foreign key on the student gets that value because we were created through the house. And then the created at and updated at timestamps are also set up. And it should work in the reverse direction. I shouldn't just be able to go from a house to students. I should be able to go from a student to a house. So if we found Wally by finding the one and only student in our table, I should be able to ask for Wally's house name, and I should see the house associated with Wally. And there it is. So that proves to me that things are working. And that's typically why I keep a console operational at all times in my Rails app, because I don't like to code too much without at least manually testing something. If I was developing this for contracting purposes, I would probably be developing a test suite, like test-driven development style. And so that would be how I was doing my testing. But because I don't have a test suite here, I'm sort of manually checking my assumptions as I go. And so how are we doing? Does anyone need to see anything that I don't have up on the screen, or is anything not working the way that it's working on my machine, but on your machine it's doing something else? Anyone? Keegan, you look like you're struggling with something maybe. Oh, okay, no worries. We can talk about that after. Cool, so that's coming along. That means we've done all of our model stuff, right? We've created the 2 models that we wanted to have in place. We only have an hour together today, so we're probably not going to get to the controller routes and view stuff, but we can get to the data creation stuff. We can create a seed script to populate our 2 tables with actual contents. And so I'm going to just quickly go to Git and commit. So I'll just say created a student model with an association to the house model. And before I go and write my seed script, it'd probably be nice to have a few validations on both of these. And so I tend to put my validations below the associations. So I'm going to say that a student will validate if the name has a presence of true. That's the only validation I'll put on there. There's sort of an undefined or implicit validation in that the foreign key is also required. And that's because when we set up that migration, we saw that null was false, right? So I can't create a student without a foreign key. So like, there's an implicit validation that we cannot create students that have no house association. And then over on house here, I'll say that both the name and the points are required. So I'll say validates name, points, presence, true. And then I'll say validates points, numericality, only integer, true. And I think that's it. I constantly go back and forth between thinking it's integer only or only integer, but that's just a quick visit to the guides away. So if I go to my validation guides, I can look up numericality, and it is only integer true. So I got it right this time. So that's good. I've got my validations set up. I can add those into Git. Added validations to the house and student model in anticipation of the seed script. And I'm going to go to the DB folder, and that's where there's this seeds.rb, and that's the place where we code up any bit of data that we want to exist in our database, and you can run this script by running a Rails command. So I'm going to remove the comments in there. I'm going to put a little comment in here by myself. Run this script using Rails DB seed. And the only thing that's a little bit awkward about this is that the file itself is called seeds with an S, but we run it with a Rails DB seed singular, and that's just a quirk. That's just the two aren't set up. In the script, we can detect what mode we're in. We can tell if Rails is in like development mode or production mode. So we could have the script do one thing and set up the database in one way when we're running in development mode with maybe a bunch of fake data. And then in production mode, we could have it set up with like maybe your app needs a little bit of data. Anytime you deploy it, you could have that in the seed script as well. I'm going to create fake data, which means I need access to Faker. And so for that, I'm going to go to the gem file, and right around here, before we start getting into like gems that belong to different groups, I'm just going to put gem Faker. This will just pull whatever the most recent version of Faker is from the Ruby Gems website, which is slightly different than what you did on the challenge, which is it pulled it directly from GitHub. And then to be sure that this actually now gets pulled into my project, I have to, from my command prompt, do a bundle install, which just checks to see if all of the gems are present, and we'll now see Faker in this list here. So I now have Faker in my project. So it's important to remember now that we're working within Rails, so we don't have to do some of the extra stuff that you had to do on the challenge or that you saw me do when I was covering Active Record outside of Rails. There's no more need to load up Active Record. There's no more need to load up Faker with require statements or an ar.rb script or anything like that. My environment is already set up for me in the context of this seeds.rb script. So I should be good to go to start creating. And so I could create a certain number of houses. So I'll say like number of houses. Maybe that's a constant. So I'll say like number of houses equals, and then I'll set that to like 5. Then I'll say like students per house, and I'll set that to maybe, yeah, I'll set that up within a loop because I'll make it a little bit randomized so that there's not always the same number of students per house. And so then I'll say number of houses dot times do, and inside of here, I'm going to create a bunch of houses. So I'll say house dot create, and I'm going to provide a name for the house and some points for the house. And then I'm going to have a house name. It's going to be something from Faker, not that. And then I'm going to have house points. And for this, Faker can generate random numbers, but it generates them as strings. So I'm just going to use the random method to generate. And I'll say a house can have any number of points somewhere in the range of 333 to 9,999. So a big range of points. And then I'm going to have to figure out which module in Faker I want to use. And for that, I got to go to the docs. So I'll just say gem Faker. And I will go to movies and Harry Potter. And it is this, what I want right here. Almost. And we know that if I want to be sure that the thing that Faker has generated is unique, I can ask for a unique of whatever I'm doing. And so the last thing that I will do today is just set this up so that it's going to take that house name for the created house name and these house points for the created house points. And then down below here, we will, maybe I'll even, yeah, I'll just say created, just as a smoke test, just to make sure things have worked properly, I'll say house.count houses. And that way, when we run this script, if we see that it created 5 houses, we'll know that it probably did the right thing. So that's the last thing we'll do today, is just run this script. It should loop 5 times, picking a unique house name each time, a random number of points, and creating those houses. So if I go to my command prompt here and I run Rails db seed, give it a moment, it'll tell me how many houses it has created. Created 6 houses. Oh, and that's because I had one in there already. So I lied, I'll do a little bit more. The very last thing I'll do is just make it so that every time we run this script, it sort of starts from fresh, so that we can run this script over and over and over, and we're not accumulating more and more data over time, that every time we run it, it'll just wipe out the data and recreate it. So I run this again. Why you do that? Oh, and that's because I have students. It's just my test data that I had in there. I can't have orphaned students, right? If I destroy the houses, there could be students that have foreign keys to houses that don't exist anymore. So that's one final step, final step. Run the script. 5 houses are created. If I poke into my console, I could say house.count. I could say house.all. There's all the houses. Hufflepuff is house number 7. And next class, we will continue updating the script so that we can create students for our houses, and then we'll actually get into creating a web view for these houses with the controller and the routing system and the views coming into play. Thank you very much, folks, for coming to class today and learning a little bit about Rails and Harry Potter.